Wine stepped into the room, her gaze immediately taking in the warm lights that bathed the space. The room was empty, but the sound of running water from the bathroom signaled that Jungkook was still in the shower. Quietly, she placed the cup of morning coffee on the bedside table. As she turned to leave, her eyes landed on a large portrait of him, hanging prominently on the wall. His strong masculine features were captivating, and without thinking, she reached out to touch it. Her fingertips grazing the image. Suddenly, the bathroom door opened. Jungkook stood there, a towel loosely slung around his waist. His wet hair dripping down his face, but Wine had not heard the door. She was too engrossed in the portrait to notice. What are you doing here? His voice was cold, cutting through the silence like a blade. Wine's heart dropped as she spun around, startled. I was just, she stammered, backing away from the portrait, her hand trembling slightly. His eyes narrowed as he stepped closer. His tone low but sharp. Just watch, touching my things without permission. Wine swallowed hard, her throat dry. No, I mean, I was just bringing your coffee. She explained, pointing weakly toward the cup on the table. Jungkook's gaze flicked to the coffee, then back to her. You shouldn't be in here, he muttered, his voice still cold but softer now, like he was holding back the full force of his frustration. He took another step closer, towering over her. I don't like it when people come into my room without asking. You know that? Why nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. I'm sorry, she whispered, lowering her eyes. It won't happen again. For a moment, he didn't respond, the tension hanging thick in the air. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Jungkook sighed, his expression softening just a fraction. Just leave. He sighed quietly, turning his back to her. Next time, knock. Without another word, Wine quickly bowed her head and left the room, her legs feeling shaky beneath her as she reached the kitchen. She pressed her back against the counter, her heart still racing from the encounter. Thank God he didn't get angrier. She breathed out, clutching her chest. She knew Jungkook hated when anyone entered his master bedroom without permission, especially the maids. But somehow, with her, it was different. He never seemed to say much when he came in, though his coldness still made her uneasy. Wine stood in the kitchen trying to steady her breathing after the encounter in Jungkook's room. When Amelia walked in, her footsteps hurried and her expression sharp. You are just resting here while Master is getting angry. Amelia's voice was filled with accusation. Wine turned to her startled. I wasn't resting. I just gave him his coffee. Why is Jungkook angry? She asked innocently, still shaken. Amelia's eyes widened and she scoffed. Jungkook, how dare you call Master by his name, huh? Before Wine could respond, a cold, familiar voice interrupted. It's none of your business. Both girls froze, their bodies stiffening at the sound of Jungkook's voice. He had appeared in the doorway, his presence imposing and commanding. Amelia, wide eyed and trembling, quickly turned to him. But, master, she stammered, she was calling you by your name. You have told us all that no maid is allowed to address you like that. That's why I was just. She paused, trying to appear innocent, but Jungkook's eyes were sharp, reading through her facade. I said. He cut her off, his voice cold. It's none of your business. You can go now. Amelia swallowed hard, her eyes flickering toward wine with anger and jealousy. She bowed stiffly to Jungkook and hurried out of the kitchen, but not before shooting wine one last glare. The door clicked shut, leaving the kitchen eerily quiet. Now, Jungkook's full attention shifted to wine. His gaze was intense, and Wine could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. Her heart raced as he slowly stepped toward her, his expression unreadable. So, Miss Wine, he sat, his voice deep, almost teasing as he closed the distance between them. Instinctively, Wine began backing up, her feet moving on their own until her back hit the kitchen shelf. She gasped softly as Jungkook leaned in closer, his towering presence overwhelming. His eyes darkened with something she couldn't quite understand. Is she telling the truth? His voice was dangerously quiet, each word sending shivers down her spine. Wine's breath hitched, her hands fidgeting nervously as she looked down at the door, unable to meet his gaze. Before she could finish, Jungkook reached out gently but firmly, lifting her chin so her eyes met his. His touch was warm despite his cold demeanor. I told you, he murmured, his eyes locking onto hers. When I talk to you, look at me in the eyes. Wine nodded weakly, her pulse racing beneath his fingertips. His presence was overwhelming, and her mind scrambled for words. So he continued, his voice still low but more insistent. You are calling me by my name. Her lips parted, but no words came. She didn't dare lie, trembling. Wine nodded, her voice barely a whisper. I'm sorry, master, I didn't mean to. Chumbuk's gaze softened just slightly as he released her chin, but his eyes remained fixed on hers. It's okay, he said quietly, surprising her. You can call me whatever you want. For a moment, they stood there, the tension thick between them. His eyes flicked down briefly, lingering on her lips. Before he stepped back, his expression returning to its usual coldness. Prepare my breakfast, he ordered, though there was a strange softness in his tone. I'm hungry, and just like that, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Wine standing there. Her mind spinning. As she clutched the edge of the shelf for support, she whispered to herself, confused. What just happened? He was so cold in his room, and now her voice trailed off as she stared at the door he would just left through. Now her voice different. Later that morning, Wine carefully prepared breakfast, placing a neatly toasted bread and a glass of freshly squeezed juice onto a tray. She carried it to the dining room where Jungkook was already seated at the head of the table, focused on the documents in front of him. Amelia was also in the room, arranging the utensils with an air of superiority. As Wine approached with the tray, Amelia shot her a sharp glance before smirking. As Wine placed the breakfast in front of Jungkook, Amelia's voice broke the silence, dripping with false concern. Master, Amelia started eyeing Wine. Shouldn't I handle the breakfast today? I noticed Wine has been distracted lately. Wine froze slightly, her hands trembling as she set down the juice. She could sense Amelia's intention to provoke her, but she kept her head down, trying to avoid trouble. Chunguk, barely looking up from his papers, responded curtly. Wine will handle it. Amelia wasn't done yet, but Master, she insisted with a forced sweetness. Shouldn't there be stricter rules? She's been acting quite casual. The insinuation wasn't lost on anyone. Amelia was beating Jungkook, trying to provoke him into reprimanding Wine. It's not your place to comment, Jungkook said, his voice low and cold. He glanced up briefly, his eyes cutting through Amelia's thin veneer of politeness. Amelia faltered for a second, her smile wavering. I just meant. Chunguk dropped his fork with a sharp clink, turning his full attention to her. What you mean doesn't concern me. You are here to do your job, not question mine. Amelia's face paled slightly as she quickly nodded. Of course, master, she mumbled, retreating back to the corner of the room, but not before throwing Wine a look filled with contempt. Wine, still standing beside the table, felt a mix of relief and nerves. Unsure if she should stay or leave, her fingers would get it by her side, her mind racing. But just as she was about to step away, Jungkook's voice stopped her. Wine, he said, his tone softer than it had been with Amelia. Sit down, she blinked, her heart skipping a beat. I'm fine, master, I don't. Sit, he repeated firmly. But there was a gentleness to his command that made her comply without further hesitation. She slowly took the seat next to him, the hands resting nervously in her lap. The dining room was quiet, the air thick with unspoken tension. Amelia still lingering at the edge of the room, pretended to busy herself, but her gaze kept flicking toward them. Jungkook picked up a piece of toast, taking a slow bite before his gaze returned to Wine. He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable before he finally spoke. Ignore her, he said quietly. His eyes briefly flicking toward where Amelia stood. She has no authority to say anything to you. Wine's eyes widened slightly. She wasn't used to Jungkook saying anything so considerate. Even if his words were still clipped and cold, she nodded, barely able to meet his intense gaze. Yes, master, she whispered, her voice shaky. He gave a small nod, satisfied. Before returning to his breakfast, as he ate, one could feel the weight of Amelia's silence fury from across the room, but she forced herself to focus on her own thoughts. Thank you, she murmured quietly after a few moments. Unsure if he heard her, Chunguk didn't. reply, but there was a brief flicker in his eyes, something she couldn't quite place. The rest of the meal passed in tense silence, but as Wine stood up to clear the plates, she couldn't help but feel that something had shifted. Jungkook was still cold, still distant, but there was a subtle change in the way he treated her. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her wonder. The next day, Wine found herself sitting in the living room, carefully placing the cushions in order. Jungkook was sitting on the sofa, one leg crossed over the other, as he spoke into his phone. His voice was steady at first, but Wine could tell from the sharpness of his tone that the call was not going well. I don't care about delays. Jungkook sat coldly, his fingers tapping impatiently on the armrest. I gave you a deadline and I expect results. He paused, listening to the response on the other end, and Wine could hear the faint sound of someone trying to explain. She glanced toward him, sensing the tension rising in the air, her heart pounding slightly from the atmosphere alone. No, don't give me excuses. Chongo growled, his voice growing louder. I pay you to handle problems, not create them. The frustration in his tone was evident. And Wine felt a knot form in her stomach as she quietly stood by the edge of the sofa, holding a few papers she had been organizing. She tried to make herself small, hoping to avoid the line of fire. This is unexpected. Jungkook snapped, his voice rising. If you can't get this done, I will find someone who can. His voice was sharp and authoritative, his anger simmering just below the surface. Without warning, he slammed the phone down, ending the call abruptly. The sound echoed in the quiet room, and mine flinched slightly at the suddenness of it. Jungkook ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling to control his temper. His jaw clenched as he stared at the phone for a moment, trying to rein in the fury that had built up during the call. As if sensing her presence, he turned his gaze toward Wine, his eyes dark with frustration. Wine, he called out, his voice low but intense. Startled, Wine quickly looked up, her heart skipping a beat. Yes, master. What are you doing? He asked, his tone sharp. His anger had not subsided, and Wine could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. I was just organizing these papers. She stammered, holding up the stack of documents she had been arranging on the side table. I didn't mean to disturb. Before she could finish, Jungkook stood up abruptly, his movements swift and commanding. He stepped closer to her, his eyes never leaving hers. And Wine instinctively backed up a step, her heart pounding in her chest. Did I say you were disturbing me? Jungkook's voice was low, almost dangerous. As he took another step toward her, the space between them seemed to shrink, and Wine felt trapped under the intensity of his gaze. No, master, she whispered, her voice barely audible, feeling the tension building in the air. Jungkook stared at her for a moment, his eyes darkening with something she couldn't quite read: anger, frustration, and something else. Something deeper, his breathing was heavy, and Wine's pulse quickened as she tried to make sense of the sudden shift in his demeanor. Come here, he commanded softly, his voice laced with a dangerous edge. Wine hesitated, her mind racing. Master, I. Before she could say another word, Jungkook reached out, pulling her closer without a sudden force. His hands gripped her waist, and in one swift motion, he crashed his lips onto hers. It was hard, urgent, and filled with all the pent up frustration he had been holding back. The kiss took Wine completely by surprise. His lips were demanding, leaving her breathless as he held her tightly against him. Her mind went blank, the sudden intensity overwhelming her senses. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, his grip firm and possessive. Chungo kissed her with a raw desperation. His fingers digging into her skin as if he needed her in that moment, a way to release the storm of emotions that had been brewing inside him. Wine's heart raced wildly, her body frozen, unsure how to react to the force of his touch. When he finally pulled away, his breathing was heavy, and his eyes were dark with a mixture of emotions anger, desire, confusion. His thumb brushed against her cheek, lingering for just a second before he took a step back. Running a hand through his hair in frustration, Wine stood there, her breath shaky. Her lips still tingling from the sudden, forceful kiss. She couldn't comprehend what had just happened, her heart still racing in her chest. Master, she began, her voice barely a whisper, still trying to catch her breath. Jungkook's gaze flickered toward her, his jaw clenched. Don't say anything, he muttered, his voice low and strange. He turned away from her, freezing slightly as if trying to regain control over his emotions. The room felt suffocating, thick with unspoken words. Wine's legs felt weak, her body trembling slightly from the intensity of what had just transpired. After a moment, Jungkook stopped freezing and turned to face her again. His expression was unreadable, but there was a softness in his eyes now, a vulnerability that had not been there before. Go, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Just go. His words hung in the air, and Vine, still dazed and confused, quickly nodded, Yes, master. She stammered before turning on her heel and rushing out of the room. As she closed the door behind her, she leaned against it for a moment, her hand pressed to her lips. Still feeling the warmth of his kiss lingering there, her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and emotions. But one thing was clear, Chunguk was not as composed as he wanted everyone to believe. Later that afternoon, after Wine had regained her composure from that earlier incident, Amelia entered the living room with a nervous expression. She approached Jungkook, who was still seated on the sofa, absorbed in his phone. Master, Amelia began hesitantly, glancing around to ensure they were alone. Can I speak with you for a moment? Jungkook looked up, irritation flickering across his face. Make it quick, I don't have all day. Amelia swallowed hard, her eyes darting to the floor. I need to ask for a week off. My mother is in the hospital and I need to be with her. Jungkook's expression hardened, a frown settling on his brow. How long do you expect to be gone? About a week, she replied, her voice shaking slightly. Do you think this is a vacation? Jungkook snapped, leaning forward in his seat. You know how things work around there. Amelia's face paled, her courage wavering under his intense gaze. I promise I will make up for the time, she said quickly, trying to appease him. He studied her for a moment, then sighed in annoyance. Fine, but don't expect me to babysit the rest of the staff while you are gone. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a wad of cash, tossing it onto the table. Take this for your mother's expenses. Just get back in one piece. Amelia nodded gratefully, relief washing over her. But Jungkook didn't give her a second glance as she hurried out of the room, eager to escape his volatile mood. The following day, Jungkook had an important meeting scheduled with a business partner. Tension hung thick in the air as they discussed critical investments and looming deadlines. The atmosphere was changed, and Jungkook's frustration grew as the negotiations dragged on. Finally, after what felt like hours, they wrapped up the meeting with a toast. The clinking of glasses was a small reprieve from the day's stress, but Jungkook's irritation bubbled just beneath the surface. He drank more than he should have, seeking to numb the pressure building inside him. That night, the front door swung open with a loud bang echoing through the quiet house. Wine jumped at the sound, her heart racing as she rushed to see what was happening. Jungkook stumbled through the doorway, his expression a mix of irritation and drunken bravado. Wine, he called out, his voice slurring slightly. Where are you? She stepped into the hallway, her stomach knotting at the sight of him. I'm here, master. Are you okay? Jungkook turned to her, a smirk playing on his lips as he leaned against the wall for support. Of course, I'm okay. Just had a long day. He took a few unsteady steps toward her, his gaze locked onto hers. You shouldn't drink so much. Wine sat, trying to keep her voice steady. What do you care? He shot back, his tone sharp. You are just my mate. Her heart sank at his words, but she swallowed her heart. I care because I don't want anything to happen to you. He took another step closer, his breath warm with the scent of alcohol. You think you can boss me around? Chagok's voice dropped low, an unsettling edge creeping in. No, I just. Before she could finish, he surged forward, grabbing her wrist and pulling her into the living room. Let's go to my room. I want to talk to you. Fear coursed through her, but there was something about the way he looked at her, something that terrified her. Master, please, she said, trying to pull away. No excuses. He growled, dragging her along. Wine felt her heart race as they entered his room, the door slamming shut behind them. Once inside, he released her wrist but stepped forward, closing the distance between them. I don't like being ignored, he said, his voice dangerously low. I wasn't ignoring you. Wine replying, her voice trembling. I was just worried. Jungkook laughed, a bitter sound that sent chills down her spine. Worried about me, he moved closer, invading her personal space. His eyes dark with a mixture of desire and anger. I don't need your concern. I need you to understand your place. What do you mean? She asked, backing away until her back hit the wall. You are not just my mate, you are mine. He sat, stepping closer again. The intensity in his gaze made her breathe hitch. And I don't like when you act like you're above me. In a sudden moment, Jungkook pinning her in place, Wine felt her heart race, a whirlwind of emotions crashing over her. Master, please, she pleaded, fear rising in her chest. But he silenced her with a fierce kiss. Wine tried to pull away, but he held her tightly, deepening the kiss as she struggled to break free. Stop fighting me. He growled against her mouth, his grip tightening. You want this. Her head spun as she felt a rush of panic and confusion. I don't want this. She managed to say, but her voice was barely audible over the pounding of her heart. Liar. He hissed, pushing himself against her harder, his hands roaming possessively over her body. Wine felt trapped, the weight of the desire suffocating her. The week following that tense encounter was a blur for Wine. Every time she saw Jungkook, she felt a mix of fear and confusion. She tried to bury her feelings to act as if everything was normal, but the weight of what had happened between them lingered heavily on her mind. As the days passed, she began to notice signs that something wasn't right. Her stomach felt uneasy, and waves of nausea would wash over her unexpectedly. Each time she brushed it off, telling herself it was just stress from the way Jungkook had treated her, but deep down, a nagging fear started to take root. What if she was pregnant? When her period didn't come as expected, anxiety consumed her. After another week of waiting, she could no longer ignore the possibility. With trembling hands, she bought a pregnancy test, her heart racing as she followed the instructions. The minutes felt like hours, and when the result finally appeared, her heart sank. It was positive. Tears streamed down her face as she sank to the floor of the bathroom, the reality of the situation crashing over her like a tidal wave. How could she tell Jungkook? The thought of revealing her pregnancy filled her with dread. She could already imagine his reaction, his cold, aggressive demeanor transforming into something terrifying. Would he force her to abort? The very idea made her stomach churn. The next few days were filled with turmoil. One trying to act normal to keep her feelings hidden, but the weight of her secret felt unbearable. She often found herself staring blankly into space, lost in her thoughts, her heart racing at the thought of facing Jungkook. One night, as she lay in bed feeling nauseous and weak, Jungkook entered the room. He noticed her pale complexion and the way she held her stomach. What's wrong with you? He asked, his voice laced with concern but edged with the usual authority. I'm just not feeling well, she replied quietly, avoiding his gaze. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. You look like you are about to faint. You need to take something for that. With that, he rummaged through the medicine cabinet, pulling out a bottle of pills and tossing it to her. Take those, you can be useless around here. Wine's heart raced at the implications of his words, but she nodded, swallowing the pills with a glass of water. As the night wore on, she struggled with her emotions. The nausea refusing to leave her, finally she knew she had to tell him. There was no way to hide it any longer. Jungkook, she said, her voice trembling. I need to talk to you about something important. He turned to her, crossing his arms. What is it? She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. I think I'm pregnant. The room fell silent, and Wine held her breath, waiting for his reaction. Jungkook's expression shifted from surprise to something more guarded. Pregnant, he echoed, his tone low. Yes, she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. I took a test and it was positive. He stepped closer, his gaze intense and unwavering. What do you want to do about it? The question sent a wave of panic through her. She stammered, feeling the weight of her decision crash down on her. I don't know, I'm scared. Jungkook watched her carefully, a mixture of emotions flickering in his eyes. We will visit the hospital tomorrow, he said faintly. You need to see a doctor. White felt a cold chin run through her. She knew what that means. You want me to get an abortion?